Hello, everyone. I'll just give a quick second for everyone to connect to audio. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely day, free of smoke. And we're now past past those wildfires, hopefully, and whatnot. All right, looks like everyone, for the most part, is connected. All right, hi everyone. My name is Samantha Bruno. I am the Assistant Director of Graduate Career Services at the Marxe School for Public and International Affairs. I'm joined here with my colleague Elise Mendel from the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. And today we are very excited to bring you the Alumni Career Chat with Michael Roman, an MPA alum, to talk about the future of work. I'm going to hand it over to Elise really quickly if you want to say a few words.
Yeah, I just want to welcome both certainly Marxe and Weissman graduate students and alumni. Thank you for coming today. Do a quick introduction. As most people here know who are students, alumni of ours at Weissman, I'm retiring at the end of the month, and I'm saying that to say Kelly, who's on the Zoom here, she is part of a career transition team, and she's a PhD doctoral student in industrial organization psychology. She's an adjunct faculty at Baruch, and now also the career go-to person for anybody who wants. So I just wanted to, just wanted to say a quick hello, Kelly, and not to, yeah, thank you. Are you able to say a quick hello, Kelly? She's got technical things happening.
Sorry, I'm not sure if you'll hear me, but again, hello, I'm Kelly. Nice to meet everyone.
Great, thanks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly and Elise. All right, so before we hand it off to Michael, I just want to let everyone know. So today, Michael has prepared a presentation for us. We want this to be interactive. So if you're able to, please keep your cameras on. We are going to have an open discussion throughout today's session. So please, unmute yourselves. But if you're in a crowded room, please, of course, mute so we're able to hear everyone. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Samantha, and good afternoon, everyone. Like Samantha noted, I am an alumni of Baruch College, privileged enough to have attended the Zicklin School of Business and the School of Public Affairs in my travels. I'm very excited to be here today and speak with you all. And like Samantha said, please be interactive, use your chat, feel free to ask questions and be on camera. I have prepared a short bit to get the conversation going with based on some of the questions that you guys submitted and talking about the future of work. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in at any time. Can everybody see my screen?
Looking good.
All right. So today we're going to talk about the post-pandemic labor market and really, what the experience is out there job searching in New York City, especially after all of the changes that have happened culturally across both the private and public sectors. There was some interest to talk about artificial intelligence, with the rise of apps and systems like ChatGPT, Google's Bard, all of these wonderful new tools that we're using in our post-pandemic era and what they really mean for us in not-for-profit areas in the corporate world and how we can leverage them best. And then, of course, I would like an opportunity to have an open discussion with you guys. So any additional questions that come up while we're speaking, please feel free to, like I said, add your questions to the chat or your comments, and we'll be paying attention to those throughout as well. So when we talk about the post-pandemic labor market now being squarely in June of 2023, you may begin hearing, on CNBC or CNN or in the media, that the Great Resignation, our labor market is cooling. And some people are confident enough to say that that era has actually come to an end. Now, statistically speaking, you can see based on this infographic that I got from CNBC that our resignation rates or the quit levels for non-farm related jobs are at our pre-pandemic levels, right? But it's important to remember that even right before the pandemic, the labor market was heating up. right? There was this appetite for many tech jobs in the private sector, and a lot of more skills being encouraged, whether they be through higher education channels or even social media channels, with people looking to reinvent themselves, right? But in 2022, we had approximately 50 million people resign from their jobs. Ample opportunities were available everywhere. I mean, in terms of the different things that you could do from an administrative standpoint, there was an appetite from employers to leverage technology in ways that we hadn't before. The quit rate has steadily declined since peaking last year. And again, you can see we're at those pre-pandemic levels, with April 2023 being where we matched based on the US Bureau of Labor Statistics report. I want to note that for folks like us who are involved in higher education, who are seeking, let's say if you're running for a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, an administrative professional, the market was very, very kind to us during this time. But we have other industries such as the food and beverage industry or the travel industry that was really, really hard hit. And a lot of those folks found themselves unemployed during the pandemic and had to reinvent themselves and had to remarket those skills. So there are folks who joined industries like in big tech or academia or healthcare, where the opportunities lent themselves for almost a reinvention. And what I liked about our experience during the pandemic is that employers were willing to take that chance. What we noted was that, you know, the qualifications, even if in the moment you feel like you're not hitting that mark of the 3 years of relevant experience or the 5 years of relevant experience, there was an equal appetite on the employer side to fill their vacancies. Because right before this, again, we were ramping up, we were actively recruiting, and the pandemic made us hit a pause that we weren't ready for. So if you guys recall, it took us a couple of months to get that vaccine ready, right? And many employers, especially in New York City, made the vaccine a requirement. So that added to people separating from their employers, again, creating more opportunities for that reinvention, more opportunities for us to healthily negotiate what our compensation packages would be, what our bonus structure might be, or even what our requirement for reporting on site might be. I'm going to speak a little bit today about what we learned in that post-pandemic market. And it's important to remember that you want to look at two perspectives. One is the employer perspective, the person who is running the business for us, right? The person who is actively recruiting for a role or a gap within their organization. And then, of course, what came out to play during the pandemic was that candidate's perspective. It truly became a candidate's market in that there was a paradigm shift where candidates are now the ones interviewing their prospective employers in the same fashion as we would see us interviewing with employers and figuring out where we might get an offer. We found ourselves with our most talented candidates having competing offers, and therefore time became very essential. When you look at the offer process, and New York City has a very lengthy requirement on background checks. It became essential that if you applied for a job and you got what we like to call a big fish on the hook, someone that you're very interested in, that you leverage the tools the pandemic gave us and you reach out to them for a phone screen or for a quick Zoom conversation or an e-introduction so that you can keep that pipeline hot, right? And that was a very, very green sign, or green flag, I would say, for candidates in the market. Employers were now reshaping their approach to recruiting, which allowed candidates to revisit, okay, what is my ask? Perhaps I don't have to settle for the lower end of the salary range spectrum. Perhaps I can ask for the midpoint, or I can do a little bit of research and in my reinvention of myself, negotiate a bonus structure or negotiate a sign-on bonus in addition to my annual compensation. So I'm going to go over the slide really quickly. From the employer perspective, becoming an employer of choice was really important. How we're marketing ourselves was important. The quality of the job description, not only as we saw them on our own personal recruiting websites and in our applicant tracking systems, but how we advertise those positions on social media like LinkedIn and leveraging that as a tool. leveraging ZipRecruiter, Monster, Indeed, and many of the sites that tend to batch opportunities, you can easily differentiate where your more mature and what I would call marketing-centric employers were framing their positions as versus an organization where they give you the position summary, the minimum qualifications, and end the advertisement at that point. What we saw during the pandemic was mature companies advertising their corporate culture. What is your experience going to be when you join and become a member of our team? We saw language begin to shift from calling members of our staff now members of our team, and just those minor shifts in how we communicate and how we represent ourselves, it became easier to identify where the cultures or employers of choice would be. One of the main things I would say from the employer perspective, and something that I can speak to in my experience, is how we measured productivity. Moving from an environment where you're required to be on site 5 days a week, probably 35 or 40 hours in excess of that a week, we spent more time in the office than we did with our families or our loved ones, right? And now we have all of these new tools like Microsoft Teams, Microsoft SharePoint. We're now having this alumni chat on Zoom, right? Which was practically unheard of prior to the pandemic. Similar to hybrid work environments. How does someone who has consistently reported to work 5 days a week for 20 years now manage a hybrid environment, manage folks who are working remotely? Someone that you can't just drive by their office and pop in and say, hey, what did that email mean? Or can you provide additional context in that conversation? So the office culture, while many might feel it was lost, really needed to be reinvented within our level of engagement. So now Microsoft Teams chats have become very popular. Online repositories for sharing documents, working on spreadsheets together through Google Documents, or whatever tools we were leveraging at the time in that remote environment really forced us to grow in ways that we weren't really anticipating. But the biggest takeaway for me was those old stereotypes of, 8 to 4 out the door. If you only do your 8 hours, you're not serious about your career. You're not committed to growing in your career. The pandemic has reshaped that mentality completely. There are individuals that now have a work-life balance that they didn't have before. So as managers, as directors, as supervisors, the onus then became on the employer to be able not only to measure productivity differently, but then how do you have an office culture or support a teamwork culture when you have one team member physically in every day of the week to provide coverage, and we may not necessarily interface with each other as often as we did before? Of course, with the pandemic, we experienced a lot of loss. So leading with empathy became a really strong charge in organizations, especially when you consider being diagnosed with COVID or some of the scary things that would happen if you had a high-risk family member that lived at home. So how you're commuting to work became a forefront conversation for us when recruiting. But historically speaking, from an HR standpoint, that's covered as a form of discrimination. If I were to ask you, how are you getting to work? Do you have feasible means to get here? Will you be here on time? Once upon a time, those questions were a do not cross. If they applied, then we anticipate that they understand what the requirements of the jobs are on getting here. But again, during the pandemic, especially with high-risk folks, not everyone having the vaccine or being able to take the vaccine, employers needed to look at their structure and see, can we still manage this level of production while being an employee-centric organization, while allowing a little more flexibility in the level of autonomy that they have with respect to reporting to the office? So employers really needed to reshape, reframe, and effectively market what their office culture would be if they wanted to remain an employer of choice post-pandemic. We can speak about simultaneously some of the generational impacts with Gen Z joining the workforce and their negotiation styles and what their requirements are for joining your team. But I think the pandemic has really stripped away the generational aspects of that privilege and made it so that everyone who is on the team would like the privilege of remote work and fair work-life balance. Now, from the candidate perspective, I will tell you that the negotiations I have been involved in have significantly changed. More people are participating in the negotiation process rather than accepting the first offer that is made to them. Later on in the pandemic, and more recently, approximately about a year ago now, New York State implemented a new law regarding pay transparency. So employers now have to post what the low range and the maximum budgeted salary for a role would be. These conversations also lent to the evolution of the negotiation process because we're now having conversations regarding total compensation, not just the gross pay or the net pay that you may be taking home, but the benefit structure, from health to dental to employee assistance programs to legal support that extend beyond just the employee themselves, but to their families, to their loved ones. Any sort of leave of absence opportunities, for example, family bonding through paid family leave was also recently passed in New York City. So the pandemic was not alone or should not be referenced alone in the significant changes that happened for our work environments, but recent legislation such as paid family leave and New York City pay transparency has reshaped the way candidates are approaching the work-life balance or the negotiation process in getting a job. With respect to coming on site and how we measure productivity, hybrid work and office culture have now also come into play when we're in that interviewing process and when we're negotiating positions. Depending on how forward-facing your role is, for example, if you work in higher education and there are students that are still coming onto campus for classes, those students may still have an expectation for on-site support. And in the absence of on-site support, we would hope that the opportunity presents itself for maybe a virtual kiosk so that I can have a conversation with my counselor or with someone in the financial aid or the bursar's office, absent of being available on campus, right? Very similarly, in forward-facing roles or administrative roles, we realize that there isn't a requirement to be physically available 5 days a week, or there isn't necessarily a requirement from an administrative perspective to be there even 3 or 4 days a week. So what we're seeing in the research is that the sweet spot is really 2 to 3 days. 2 days a week, the negotiations really start to tamper down and you get the person now really engaged and wanting to hear more about, all right, if I'm on site 2 days a week, what can I expect from your office culture? What level of engagement can I expect from the team? Or what level of support can I expect from the team? And that's where we have this infographic where the conversations regarding work-life balance are happening and they are extremely direct. Where I said earlier in the sense of the commute, folks with family lives, those of us who have children, are now being more transparent than ever to say, I will be able to effectively work and give you a solid 8 hours of production. I will be able to excel at this position. However, I still have an expectation that I be able to leave at 5 o'clock or pick up my child from certain events or be engaged in my personal life. Samantha, I saw you had a hand up.
No, I was clapping. I put up a clapping reaction for that.
All right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So when we talk about the evolution of negotiations, it's important to note, I've been in human resources going on 20 years this summer. And speaking about having children or speaking about your family life or anything that you have outside of work was almost unheard of. That would tank your interview almost immediately. And legal professionals would advise you not to enter into any conversations related to personal aspects of that individual's candidacy. But frankly, the market has shifted so significantly that not only are employers required to both strategically and quickly reach out to the most qualified individuals in the applicant pool, they're now having to have conversations that we were explicitly mandated not to have before. So becoming a more employee-centric, leading with empathy, reshaping how we frame conversations, not only for prospective candidates, but for new hires who are being onboarded, inform whether or not you will have a successful recruiting experience. What also I haven't touched on are the experience that some folks will take a job and then ghost you right after if they feel they're not a culture fit. I've had individuals begin a role on Monday only to resign by Wednesday. They don't even complete a whole week. And that has put employers on notice that if you're selling a bill of goods throughout the recruitment process and don't deliver that experience once the individual starts, the market is still hot enough with competing offers that that individual can and will take their talents elsewhere. So rather than practice theoretical recruiting or theoretical onboarding, it's important to be genuine and authentic during this process, as there is much competition in this very hot labor market throughout New York City. So with that, I also wanted to talk about the evolution of interviewing, because I imagine many of us are in this labor market and we're seeing these new postings go up and we see these really wide salary ranges. I mean, I've seen some with $40,000 to $50,000 swings, from 50 to 100 grand to do the same job. But as an HR professional, I can't stand by those swings, given you understand the scope and responsibility of that role. So how have employers switched their game in the evolution of interviewing? And I wanted to share with everybody here, if you're interviewing now, what you can expect from folks that are trying to reframe their recruitment experience. And at the top, we have competency-based interviews, and that infographic where you have knowledge and attitude and experience, your skills, and what is informed by your past experience. Whereas on the bottom, we'll talk about behavior-based interviews, which focus on your past behavior, your discernment, your judgment, and how you exercise that. So I wanted to speak briefly, and I'll define these, on competency-based interviewing, assessing those specific skills where employers ask questions that aim to evaluate your proficiency in those areas. So if you tell me that you're proficient in Microsoft Office, and I see this often, and then we take it a step further, I'm proficient in Microsoft Excel. The definition of proficiency is different for everyone. So I may ask you a very direct question about what formulas you use in Excel. How do you manage pivot tables and VLOOKUPs, and how do you reconcile large data sets? And if you aren't at a minimum conversational, that is a red flag. And that's what we call a competency-based question. So in this example for financial analysis, you may be asked, tell me about a time when you were responsible for conducting complex financial analysis. What methodologies did you use, and how did you ensure accuracy and attention to detail in your work? These questions are specifically targeted for you to be able to provide an example where not only showcasing the skills you gained from higher education, but how did you put those skills into practice? What was the outcome? How did you ensure accuracy? How did you measure the quality of your work? And what we're looking to find with questions like this is a level of autonomy where you're self-checking, where you're not relying on escalation to your supervisor or other peers to catch those mistakes. We also want to hear about what tools you're using or how you're using those tools to make the work better, more seamless and efficient. Conversely, employers are now incorporating more behavior-based interviewing questions, which focus on, again, your past behavior. The interviewer asks questions that require you to provide specific examples of how you've handled certain situations in the past. For example, tell me about a time when you had to build a strong relationship with a difficult client, and I'm sure many of us have been there. How did you approach that situation? And what strategies did you use to establish that rapport? And what we find, especially in the recruiting stage, is that we're looking to see how people manage conflict. How does someone react when they are not placed in the ideal situation? Are they adaptable? Are they resilient enough to be able to shift in the way that many of us as employers and employees or team members had to do so during the pandemic? And so that from an employer perspective, you're making as best or as close to a fully informed decision on how that candidate not only will be a competency fit for the role, but a culture fit for the entire team. How will I be able to manage this individual in a hybrid work environment, right? And for us as employers, it's very difficult to measure that if we're only focused on competency-based questions. So what we're noticing is a shift to include more behavior-based questions so that we can measure that judgment. There's a STAR methodology in the infographic I want to talk about, and we added the T for takeaways. You should expect for your interviewer to describe a situation for you. What was your task in the situation? What did you have to do? What was the action that you had to take? What were the results? And then your takeaways, what did you learn? And the best advice I can give you is to make sure that when you're walking into an interview situation, that you have at a minimum 3 examples that exemplify not only your competence for that role, but a way in which you can show how you exercised your judgment, how you came to a decision with perhaps competing priorities or bringing the team together as a whole for an all hands on deck type of situation. You not only are charged with exemplifying that you can do the job, but that you're going to do it diplomatically and with tact. With respect to artificial intelligence, and this is where the conversation I think gets a little exciting, right? There were many questions that were submitted about how we're leveraging AI in the workplace, right? So whether it's ChatGPT, which I know is very popular from OpenAI, Bard from Google, Bing from Microsoft, there are many options out there. We have well said and beautiful AI as well for curating your PowerPoint presentations, for doing voiceovers on training. But the truth is, it hasn't been widely adopted in the workplace. It is very much still an individual's decision as to whether or not they are going to leverage this technology. Now, speaking personally, I will say, yes, I absolutely leverage ChatGPT. I love it as a tool. And for me, it has taken Google to the next level, even though Bard is Google's. Typically, we rely on Google and Yahoo search engines to get answers. But ChatGPT, Bard, and Bing have been able to pretty much scour the internet and put a lot of information in one place. As far as it being effective, I will tell you that there are certain pitfalls. In some common examples, like what you're using ChatGPT and some of these AI tools for. Many of us are using them administratively. For example, I draft up an email, or I ask ChatGPT to draft up an email. What I found in practice is that these AI tools can be very repetitious. So it sometimes becomes obvious when you're sending an email or you're using AI to do something, and it repeats the same point over and over, lacking greater context. And that for me showcases that there still needs to be a human element. ChatGPT or any of these AI search engines aren't ready for widespread implementation to be fully relied on, simply because context and human behavior needs to inform the approach. So I know we've heard certain healthcare applications, before we had WebMD, where you type in all your symptoms and you hope to reverse engineer, this fungal infection or whatever we got going on here, right? ChatGPT can do that for you. But again, it's not 100% accurate because the context matters. I'm sure we've all seen recently in the news the legal applications, right? Getting a lawyer is really expensive. But ChatGPT hasn't necessarily passed the bar exam. So you want to be very careful in leveraging the information that it provides. And I believe most recently, maybe a month ago, a lawyer was caught using ChatGPT and had referenced a case that was non-existent. So that's yet again another example of the artificial intelligence still being in its infancy. While it's an incredible tool for our time, generationally speaking, it isn't one that we can rely on completely to adopt our positions. I read something really interesting that said, artificial intelligence isn't going to replace workers. However, Workers who leverage artificial intelligence will replace workers who do not. And that is where I tend to agree. For example, in creating training courses, ChatGPT or any of these AI tools are really good at giving you a structure. They can outline your meetings for you. They can give you a high-level elevator pitch or summarize as much information as you give them, but it's within the context that you provide. Any variables that you may be subconsciously looking at or considering as a human won't necessarily come out to play in the results that you're given. So where I see the best value in using artificial intelligence right now, not only in rewriting some of your communications, right, but your resumes. The resume writing tool, when you're able to leverage some of this AI, can reframe how you market yourself. And when you're in the labor market applying to jobs, your introduction to your prospective employer is your resume. So whether it's providing you a summary of your expertise or highlighting some of your core competencies or reframing what your core responsibilities were, I find artificial intelligence to be an exceptional tool at helping people curate and market themselves, as that is not a skill many of us possess, right? Hence why we have outsourced a lot of those LinkedIn profiles, or we ask someone in HR to review our resumes because we may not necessarily see it through the same lens. But I will give credit where credit is due. Artificial intelligence as an administrative tool with the appropriate end user leveraging the technology for what it's made for in its infancy can really elevate your game and how you market yourself in this labor market. So with that, I know we have about 25 minutes left. I wanted to offer open discussions. I'm not sure if there are questions in the chat, but many of you did submit some great questions that I would like to highlight here and maybe have a conversation about. Unless Samantha, are there any that we should reference with you?
No, thank you, Michael, so far. Like, this presentation has been so informative. What I would recommend for this open discussion is that if whoever is joining from a computer or desktop or laptop of any kind, if you change your view up on the top right corner to side-by-side gallery, you'll be able to see both the presentation and everyone that's in the room at the same time. And I'll throw that in the chat as well. But Michael, I'll turn it back over to you to get started with the open discussion.
Perfect. Okay, so one of the first questions that we received was, is New York City's salary transparent law effective? What can be done to improve it? And do you see other places following suit? I will say, I think the New York City's pay transparency law is effective. It's, again, in its infancy and how it's being interpreted and how it's being applied. I mentioned earlier in the deck that I've seen some places post very, very wide salary ranges. And that can be intimidating, right? If you understand the scope of the role, the responsibilities of the role, then you would anticipate that any offer that you're being made is commensurate not only with your experience, but the expectations from that employer. I prefer to see tighter salary bands, let's say a swing of 10 or 20K. But to see a swing of 50K or even some of them at 100K swings, I think is a bit disingenuous on some employers' parts. It doesn't really represent how they're going about their recruiting process. And it frankly encourages people to always ask for the max. Because as employers, we should be prepared to answer the question on our rubric. What informs our decision on offering someone the midpoint versus the higher end of a range is a question you should all feel very empowered to ask prior to engaging in the salary negotiation standpoint. I also want to reference a couple of years ago, Local Law 67 was passed, wherein employers can no longer base your future salary offers based on what you were making in a prior role. And I just want to highlight that as a critical turning point, because I know unrelated to the pandemic, when I first started out in HR, not only was it asked for every role on the employment application what your current salary was, we would require you to submit 2 pay stubs so that I could validate and reverse engineer your annual salary and provide you a percentage-based increase based on your prior compensation. Now, New York City pay transparency has completely done away with that because there's no way to close some of the wage gaps that we have in New York City, whether they be the gender wage gap or some of the issues that we see across diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I do think it's effective. I think it's a great step in the right direction and the evolution of how we have these difficult conversations about negotiations. But at the same time, I do think there's a ways to go in terms of how employers have interpreted that law and put it into practice. Again, very wide swings can be intimidating, but I do like to see tight salary ranges so that you can see that's a sign of a mature and elevated employer. Any questions or comments related to salary transparency before I go on to the next one? Okay. How does remote work affect the effectiveness of HR? And by far, this was my favorite question. I personally do not believe I need to physically be available to provide exceptional or quality customer service. As I spoke about earlier, employers have needed to reframe how they manage in terms of leading with empathy, being able to have difficult conversations, not just about operational needs, but the personal needs of your team members and what's important for them at that given point in time. There's also a cost associating for recruiting. So retention becomes a very big conversation that you want to have in terms of making sure that you're promoting a positive and quality work experience for these individuals. To answer the question from an administrative standpoint, remote work has actually made me more efficient in that from a pushing buttons from a transactional way, I can get you on payroll much quicker because I don't have that interruption of the drive-bys in the office, right? The water cooler talk has dissipated, for lack of a better term. So I find myself to be more focused and more productive from a transactional standpoint. Now, from a relationship building standpoint, that has taken a little more effort. New hires who joined during the pandemic may not always feel a sense of belonging because they haven't been able to establish that rapport in person. And frankly speaking, there's just a different human sense to certain conversations in person than there is virtually. When we're talking about leaves of absences or FMLAs or things that are impacting your family in a way that is very sensitive and emotional to talk about, I do prefer those conversations to be in person. Any sort of disciplinary actions, including termination, I think we all remember at the height of the pandemic, all the layoffs happening on Zoom, those didn't really feel tactful if you're promoting a healthy culture. So there are certain actions that I believe as a leader need to happen in person. In order to be authentic and genuine and employee-centric, certain conversations have to happen on site. But in terms of the overall effectiveness of HR, I would argue that the remote tools and the ability to be focused in an environment where I can be transactional and administrative has elevated our game and the experience of people who have joined our organization.
Thanks, Michael. We actually have a question in the chat from Elizabeth. Thank you. She asked, how do you think roles becoming more virtual will impact the New York labor market, and might we navigate that if we want to stay? There are many HR/less client-facing jobs getting moved to states that have lower costs of living, since they can pay less while the money goes farther.
Yes, that is a great point. Now, I think, you know, for our smaller organizations, for our non-for-profit friends, for folks with, let's call it less than 30 employees or 50 employees, I believe is the threshold. I don't know that that is their experience or really something that they're able to leverage. But larger employers, I have seen, are allowing folks to work in different states. And I believe from a taxation law perspective, and I am not a tax lawyer, refer to your tax professional, right? there is the ability, because of lower cost of living, and I think the threshold is 60%. So if you work 3 days a week out of another state consistently, then they will consider you an employer of that state. And the question then becomes whether or not your current employer, who's New York City based, is able to file taxes and do what they have to do from one central location. Now, for the Amazons, for the Twitters, the Metas, all of those name brand companies, yes, they're well versed. That works for them. And I'm sure they are leveraging talent, not only across the United States, but across the globe, right? And I'm sure we've all dealt with outsourcing when we call our telephone company and the person may not necessarily be in the United States at the time of that conversation. I will say, if you're not in one of those Fortune 500 companies, the evolution of that opportunity is slow, but it does exist. It is rare, and it takes not only work on the employer side, but it takes a commitment in terms of how you're managing your finances on your end, because while the cost of living and the reality of working from a different state may work for you, what is that experience from a culture standpoint, right? What is your experience in terms of your level of engagement with the rest of the team? And it remains to be seen, Samantha, and I apologize for the name of the person who asked the question. It remains to be seen what career growth looks like in a hybrid environment. Are folks who work more predominantly remote being promoted at the same pace as individuals that come into the office? So while the perks are obvious and they feel great, especially during the summer months, there may be a cost that we have yet to see in terms of that career trajectory, which I'd be very interested in a couple of years to see the statistics on how recent graduates who went into a remote environment fared 5 or 10 years into their career versus an individual who was mandated on site 4 or 5 days a week.
Michael, actually, I had a couple questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely, thank you.
It has 4 parts to it, maybe, but one, I was wondering if you want to speak a little bit about applicant tracking systems. I know a lot of large companies use them. And the other thing is, what do you look for in a candidate? You've hired in, I know, at Health and Hospital Corporation and higher education, in terms of resume, cover letter, and then also in the interview. Like, what stands out for you? So applicant tracking systems, and how here should people think about formatting their resume, cover letter, and interview prep so that they would stand out to you, for example?
Yes, that is a great question. Thank you for asking that. And I think not only has the interviewing process evolved, but the way people market and present themselves in writing has evolved as well. Whether you're leveraging artificial intelligence like ChatGPT to reframe some of your responsibilities, the biggest takeaway that I've seen, and what I'm actually encouraging my hiring managers to look at, are measurable outcomes, right? So if you say, for example, that you manage the onboarding for a particular company, we want to see metrics. How many people have you onboarded or trained? What percentage of those people went on to do X, Y, or Z? If you're in financial services, for example, and you say you perform reconciliation efforts at the end of a fiscal year, can you share with us from a metric standpoint what percentage of revenue you saved or corrected? Key performance indicators also become something that I look for immediately, because many people on their resumes, let's go back 5 or 10 years, would say, I've done this, I can do that. And resumes have evolved from what I can do to what I have done. And here's an example. Okay, so post-pandemic, I would argue much more competitive, especially if you're asking for a 6-figure salary. I anticipate that not only you have measurable competencies, but you're going to show me how you measured the efficacy of what you are implementing, or what you saved, or what the impact to the organization was. Specifically referencing the cover letters, and what I would argue is an extension of the cover letter, your professional summary at the top of the resume. You have just a few sentences to give me a reason to continue reading. So you want to capture that, right? If you applied to a job, right? The old adage was, self-motivated HR professional seeking career change in the dental or healthcare industry, right? You're giving us the intention of what you're looking for. But by virtue of applying, your intention is to get this job. So we want to use that real estate on your resume to say, here's what I've accomplished. I'm a 10-year seasoned professional with these types of outcomes. Proven, dedicated, whatever buzzword you want to use. Again, think of it from a measurement standpoint. Don't tell me what you can do. Tell me what you have done so that I can then ask you about it and correlate it to my organization and how your skills are going to benefit the existing team. In terms of applicant tracking systems, they are evolving. Many companies I see are still leveraging ZipRecruiter, LinkedIn, Monster.com, Indeed, and those can be effective ways of getting your resume out to 100 jobs. But it's important to remember that if this is really a job that you are inspired by, you're really interested in, I would ask you to challenge yourself to customize that resume and apply directly on the employer's website. And the reason for that is because you do want to differentiate yourself in some way, shape, or form. I cannot tell you how many times I've received 200 applicants to a certain administrative position, only to find that many of them are looking for a career change or a career shift, but haven't really exemplified how their skills translate industry to industry. Most recently, I had a conversation with a young woman who has been a dental assistant for much of her career and is interested in becoming an HR professional on the administrative standpoint. And until our conversation, she didn't realize how some of those forward-facing customer service competencies in her experience does translate well to the administrative aspect of human resources. So many times it takes a conversation with someone in the industry to help you better frame how you're marketing yourself in those ways. Again, from an applicant tracking system standpoint, your resume is your introduction to that organization. And if you're representing yourself in a very broad strokes kind of way, you're not necessarily differentiating your skills or advertising what you bring to the table in the way the other 199 may have. This is still very much a hot labor market. It is still very much the ball being in your court and you able to dictate what your negotiation is going to feel like. So just then imagine what the expectation of those resumes and what that interviewing experience will command if these are the types of salaries we're talking about.
Absolutely. These are all really good points. And actually, something that I'm writing down very quickly is like the whole thing with your professional summary, not what you can, that's not just only what you can do, what have you done? What are you bringing to the table? Absolutely. I think that's something I've definitely seen that paradigm shift, even within like career services. Absolutely. So we are in like the last 10 minutes of today's session. I just wanted to poke around to see if anyone had any questions they wanted to ask, either out loud by unmuting or throw anything into the chat. Michael is prepared with all the questions that were submitted on the chat too, as well. Okay.
But you still look at cover letters, right? I'm sorry, I just can't help myself here. You still look at cover letters? Do you require
Yes.
them? Okay.
We do. So applicant tracking systems typically require cover letters. I will tell you this. If you have proficient in Microsoft Office on your resume, and then your cover letter is absent punctuation, your cover letter does not, it doubles as a writing sample. Don't forget that. So if you're applying to jobs and your cover letter has errors on it, I would argue your proficiency. And frankly, that's one of the red flags that I'll say, I'm going to move on. I may not even call you for a phone screen. Similarly, the real estate on your resume is important. Use every square inch of that 8.5 by 11 page. Okay, every inch. So don't waste too much space on skills that you don't want to be asked on, or aspirations or hobbies that you might have. Again, you want to leverage that space to showcase what you're bringing to the table and how you measure the effectiveness of your skills. The outcome-oriented spaces on your resume should be what's highlighted. and take that and incorporate it into your cover letter. Reference your resume in that cover letter. So now I have to look at both documents to understand the full context of what you're bringing to the table.
Right. Marla, did I see your hand up?
You did. At what point is it appropriate to move to the multi-page CV approach rather than the pithy every inch counts resume approach?
That is a very, very good question. And I would say relevant experience should be at the top. Typically, when you go through resume writing, they try to put things in chronological order or reverse chronological order with your most recent role at the top and at the bottom. So the answer to your question can be different for individuals who are already on a career path versus individuals who are looking for a career change. But again, if you have, let's say, 10 years of relevant experience across multiple roles, not one role, then I would argue you can start to look at the second page. But again, I'm looking for the meat, right, Marla? So do you have 2 pages worth of outcome-based information for me to read? Many times we fill our resumes with provided excellent customer service to many clients. That's a line that can be removed and can be used in a summary, right? If customer service is one of the areas of your expertise. But again, if it's relevant to the role that you're applying for, I say go for the 2 pages, assuming multiple roles and at least 10 years of experience. If you're under 10 years of experience on a particular type of function you're applying for, I would argue 1 page should suffice.
I have a second question. I see Michelle has her hand up. If we get time, great. If we don't, no worries. I'm curious how Columbia, I believe you're at Columbia now, has changed policies post-pandemic or is looking ahead to shift policies relating to supporting their workers. If you could share anything on that, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Yes,
Over to Michelle.
we are really looking at becoming a more employee-centric organization, and we're being very intentional in the language that we're using when framing that. We've also created opportunities in a council surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, while adding a sense of belonging to that as well. So from a global standpoint, there have been ways, especially during the pandemic, by enhancing our health and safety policy, right? We have an Office of Work Life dedicated to offering services and having conversations such as these, not only about career-based issues, but about what might be happening at home, and what legal services you might need, let's say, for adopting a child or for getting out of a lease agreement or things of that nature. So what I would say is similar to what I spoke about in the deck earlier, we are expanding the opportunity for conversation beyond just what our operational need is. And we're looking more at that human employee-centric aspect of building a team and that sense of belonging campus-wide.
Thank you.
Shell, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, hi. I have a question. I've been in healthcare for mostly all my life. I worked in my last 2 jobs within, like, I'd say about 15 years was mainly technical management work. I was laid off and then I went back to school. So I just graduated with my master's in corporate communication. I'm going back out into the work field. So now I'm trying to blend all my technical skills that I had, plus the additional, I guess, academic, the degrees that I gained. So I guess my dilemma now is to merge the 2. And I know before you spoke about salary. For me, I'm looking at the salary that I left and what I'm going to be asking for, and the system that I worked on in healthcare, they're outdated, they no longer existed. So I have a lot of dilemmas in between for me to describe my skills, to say what I did, what system I worked on. That system no longer exists. Now it's Epic. So I guess that's my question that I wanted to put out there.
Okay.
Like,
Well,
how
thank you,
do I
Michelle.
merge all of that together? And then with explaining myself, like you said, the system no longer exists. So it's kind of hard to put all of that together.
I think this is a really great question. And first and foremost, congratulations on going back to school and completing your degree. I am familiar with the EPIC system in terms of being what we call in healthcare an EMR, an electronic medical record. And what I would say to you or someone in your position, Michelle, is that while the name of the system has changed, when you get into the weeds of what the system is doing, many of the fields are the same. They've just been rebranded. So let's talk about really quickly the technical expertise in healthcare for an electronic medical record is the personal information of the patient, the diagnosis or the prognosis of what that patient is going through, what type of treatment plan they're going to be on, what type of follow-up is required. So whether your EMR is Epic-based or paper-based, if you're in a smaller healthcare organization like an urgent care, I would argue the name, yes, the label, the branding, it has changed. But your skills, fundamentally speaking, do translate and do apply. What I would say is we need some confidence in those skills, whether they be administratively or technically when you're communicating about them, so that you inspire confidence in me to continue the conversation during the recruiting part of your candidacy. Again, I spent 13 years in healthcare, so I'm not sure if you're more of an administrator or a healthcare provider, but again, healthcare from a technical standpoint has not significantly grown in the way other technologies have, being that the parameters that we're inputting and the data we're leveraging has consistently remained the same, I would argue, for at least the last 15 years.
By the way, I worked at Columbia too. Well, that's one of my last jobs.
Nice.
Well,
Well,
thank you
congratulations
so
again, and thank you for the question.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, everyone. To everyone, please help me give a round of applause to Michael for joining us today. Michael, this has been very, very informative. I know this has been a hot topic that we've been covering all the time over in career services. I know we're at the 2 o'clock hour, but I just want to give you a chance to leave any imparting words for our guest here today.
I just want to say, you know, as an alumnus of Baruch and CUNY, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm always enthused to partner and engage with you guys. And, you know, I'm grateful for the people that came before me and provided these opportunities. And I hope that our professional paths cross one day. I'm excited to see, you know, what Baruch continues to produce as that we continue to graduate and seek further higher education degrees. So thank you guys, honestly and truly. It was an honor and a privilege to speak with you today.
Thank you so much. This won't be the last time you'll see Michael, and Michael, you'll absolutely be hearing from us again. So everyone, please have a great rest of your week. Enjoy the day. We look forward to seeing you all at our next event, and have a great summer. Bye now.